Last night, Labour got trounced in the election, and I'm going to look at why that was in a quick video. The first reason, Brexit. People across the country voted for Brexit in a referendum. It was a free, fair election, or free, fair referendum. People had the right to vote either to remain or to leave the EU. They voted to leave. You can disagree with that. I personally didn't vote for it to leave, but it was a completely legitimate free vote, the largest vote in British history. And in response to that, Labour and the other Remain parties simply refused to accept the result, called everyone, which in many cases were part of their core constituencies, low information, duped by Russia, racist, a number of different things. In some cases, maybe people were racist, but the way that they discussed the people who voted for Brexit was completely dismissive and verging on openly anti-democratic, and in the case of the Lib Dems, explicitly anti-democratic, in that they wanted to revoke Article 50. They used all the means they could, the courts, bending constitutional procedures to try and stop the result of a free vote being enacted. They then had another election in which, in that election, they put in their manifesto that they would respect the result of the referendum. They did not. And then they tried to have another referendum. The Lib Dems wanted to revoke Article 50. Labour wanted another referendum in which they would have the option to remain or to leave with a Labour deal, which would be basically a soft form of remaining. And the core constituencies, many of the core constituents, Labour constituencies, just weren't going to buy that. They voted to leave, and they don't like being treated basically like crap. So yeah, I didn't vote to leave, but I can completely understand why a vast swathe of the electorate found that completely off-putting, whether or not they voted leave or not. The second reason, people were fed up, in particular on the Labour, but in general across the left front, with the censorious, illiberal and hypocritical approach people had to other people's views. So you could be basically anywhere right of momentum and receive a massive amount of abuse from well-known individuals and politicians for essentially being what they would describe as hard right or far right or extremist or fascist in some cases, as they would refer to some people who clearly were not fascist. And people are just fed up with that. They're basically referring to most of the electorate as far right fascists, when in fact that's not the case in so many of those cases. So that's another reason people are fed up of being told they're fascist for simply disagreeing with what a far left group thinks. And it's the hypocrisy of it as well. So there'd be attacks on right-wing figures, like Nigel Farage would get milkshake thrown at him, which, okay, you don't have to support Nigel Farage to think that that is not something you should be endorsing or not something you should be making excuses for. And loads of left-wing figures would come out saying, oh, it's all part and parcel of political life, there's nothing wrong with it, and then start talking about why they hate Nigel Farage. But if anything happens to a left-wing figure or to a Remainer figure, for example, Anna Soubry getting heckled or Owen Jones getting heckled, which is also not something you want to see, there is uproar, and those people will discuss it as if it's the return of fascism. We must do everything we can to stamp it out immediately. So it's the astounding double standards there, which I think people find annoying. The third reason is much too much sympathy with terrorists and Islamist jihadists in particular, and in relation to that, the anti-Semitism scandal. So, for example, following the death of bin Laden, Jeremy Corbyn called it, I think it was a tragedy, and he was saying the tragedy was that international law hadn't been obeyed, but that's the strangest response to a mass murdering theocratic extremist being killed in response to him murdering about 5,000 people on American soil, innocent civilians. Baghdadi, head of ISIS, who had brutally murdered and raped and killed ethnic minorities and women and gays and Jews and Christians and all different groups across the world. Baghdadi was killed. He blew his own suicide vest up along with his kids, and Corbyn, instead of praising the actions of the military who risked their lives to take this guy out, responded to it in a critical manner, saying, I can't remember exactly the term he used, but it was like a critical term, saying that it was very sad or something. It was like, you get the impression that the US had done something wrong, when in fact that is the strangest way ever to interpret that. He's also hung out with Hamas. Hamas make videos, which I'll link to in the bottom. I've made videos discussing this before, in which they openly encourage children to stab all Jews in the world. That's not a lie. Hamas are an Islamist extremist group. They're labelled extremists by the British government or terrorists by the British government. Corbyn has met with them. He's called them his friends. In their charter, Hamas said, a quote from the Hadith saying, "O Muslim, when the time comes, the tree will shout, 'There's a Jew behind the tree, come and stab the Jew,' or something." It's the most anti-Semitic stuff you've ever heard. It quotes the protocols of the Elders of Zion. On and on. Rayed Salah, he's an extremist Islamist preacher. He's referred to Jews as germs. He said that Jews put the blood of innocent people in their bread. He said that Jews are behind 9/11. There are videos of Corbyn hugging him and saying he deserves tea because he's had a hard time and stuff like that, and then going straight on to criticise Israel. He's spoken at events where there are Islamist flags flying repeatedly. He hasn't batted an eyelid about that. Shamima Begum, his response to that has basically been, in many ways, critical of the fact that we're not letting her back, which, fine, maybe we should let her back, but the way in which he approaches it is always from an apologist standpoint. So people see that as anti-Western. They're completely fed up with it, and they've had enough of it. The fourth reason is the cultural aspect, i.e. the idea that any dissent from that particular leftist stance means you're right-wing. So I've kind of talked about that before, or not just right-wing, but far-right and in some way despicable. And that has been so heavily endorsed by so many, for example, media figures, celebrities. You'll see how many celebrities have you seen come out and say, "Oh, if you want to vote for Brexit, if you want to support the Conservatives, I don't agree with you, but you may as well go ahead and do it." Barely any. How many have you seen who've come out and said, "Anyone who votes for Boris Johnson is a fascist, is disgusting, you dare do that, we must mobilise and fight against this guy, blah, blah, blah." And that just thinks loads of ordinary people watch that and think, what on earth are these people, these millionaires who basically don't really know anything more about politics than anyone else? Why are they suddenly lecturing us from this one particular far left standpoint? So you can agree with the far left standpoint, but it's the complete homogeneity of celebrity and kind of woke mainstream opinion, which I think loads of people have reacted to. The final reason is Corbyn and co have actually appeared on platforms speaking with massive photos of tyrants, communist tyrants from the past, and not cared about that at all. So I'm not sure about Corbyn, but there are literally photos of John McDonnell speaking with huge banners of Mao and Stalin behind him. I might put a link to that in the description. So if someone spoke in front of a massive photo of a fascist leader, they would rightly be called completely beyond the pale and would basically be banished from mainstream political life completely legitimately. And it would be the left who would be making those arguments. But for some reason, when left-wing figures speak in front of huge banners of totalitarian, murderous dictators, you're not meant to care about that at all. So there's a hypocrisy there. So yeah, in conclusion, those are my thoughts on why it's happened. To some extent, I'm happy about this because I do think that branch of hugely illiberal, censorious, regressive, terrorist-sympathising leftism is not a good thing. But at the same time, I'm not ideologically right-wing necessarily, so I think that it could be a good thing in a way because it will allow the left potentially to move back into a more rational position. But those are just some thoughts I've got because I've seen a lot of people saying, how on earth has this happened? Like, I never expected this in a million years. But as someone who's been on the end of this stuff and been trying to say, look, you have to be less illiberal, more tolerant of dissenting views. You need to stop apologising for Islamists. You need to stop saying that everyone who voted for Brexit is a fascist and that we must simply ignore the vote. This seems like a logical endpoint. So that's my thoughts for that. Please subscribe to the channel. Please give this video a like. And this is also a YouTube. This is also a podcast, so you can listen to the podcast. It's E2 Review. Search that on iTunes. Thanks.